The big change is the change it's going to make in the role of Russia. Russia has been an energy superpower. Putin said he didn't like the term, but he liked the money and the political clout. But I think Russia's days as an energy superpower are now receding.
Do you think that Europe can wean itself from Russian oil?
I think it can. I think it will take time to do that. I think the pressure since what's happened the last 2 weeks is really added to the momentum, not for sanctions that will play out in 2 years from now, but sanctions much more quickly, because Putin is earning a lot of money from oil and gas right now.
How much is he earning each day?
Well, I can tell you, I was just looking at the numbers from Europe alone. If you annualize from where he is today, it'd be like $250 billion, just Europe. And Europe's only about half of his oil sales.
So if Europe cut off oil sales from Russia, how big of a dent would that put in Russia's economy?
Oh, it's a big deal because oil and gas together are around 40% of the total Russian budget, and also obviously foreign trade. So it would be a big hit. And I think that's why you see right now the Ukrainian government is really leading a campaign to get people to self-sanction and ultimately to get to sanctions. And we see that working. We see dock workers refusing to unload Russian oil, banks not writing letters of credit. So it's going to get more and more difficult for Russian oil anyway. And I think the EU is getting closer to some outright ban.
But isn't oil a commodity? And if the Russian oil isn't sold to Europe, it'll just be shipped to China or somewhere else?
I think that's certainly partly true. And we can already see India is saying we want to buy Russian oil, particularly because we can get it at a big discount and we can pay in rupees and not in dollars. But I think that only some of that oil will get sold. I think it will be there'll be physical logistical issues. There will be issues about being able to get insurance for tankers and a host of other things that will impede it. So some of it will get sold, but some of it won't. And by the way, it'll be sold at a big discount.
Is there any way to get India and China to try to stop importing Russian oil, or are they totally dependent on it?
I think China's not totally dependent. It gets a lot of oil from Russia. It gets a lot of oil from the Middle East. I think there's very little influence on China to get them to buy less oil. I think there's going to be a lot of diplomacy with India because, of course, India has also gotten closer to the United States on this group of countries that are sort of around China with Australia and Japan. So I think there's going to be a big focus. And Biden just had a phone call with Modi where you can be sure that this would have been one of the topics.
So when Biden talked to Prime Minister Modi of India, what would be his ask?
Well, his ask would be on the energy front, which is not to pick up the slack on Russian oil and to talk about all the areas where the U.S. and India can collaborate. India, of course, has a long historic relationship with Russia. And unlike its relationship with China, which is fraught with tension, it's been a partnership, and a substantial part of the Indian army is equipped with Russian armaments. So what I hear from Indians, they say, well, the U.S. is a fickle friend, and Russia has been our long-term friend. So I think India is still trying to find is trying to balance between the two.
One of the things President Biden did was open up the strategic oil reserve. In fact, he opened up the spigots pretty wide. Explain that to me and what he can be doing in that regard.
Well, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was basically created after the 1970s oil crises so that you were prepared for an emergency, a disruption. And we are looking at a disruption in world energy right now, particularly as this war goes on. And it could be more serious than that of the 1970s because it involves not only oil, natural gas, and coal, it also involves the two nuclear superpowers. So using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I think was a really smart idea to use it at scale because it gets a lot of oil into the market, helps reduce the potential shortage because it was a very tight market anyway going into the crisis. So it's a big development. Walter, the other big development that's affecting the oil market right now is the resurgence of COVID in China, which is taking Chinese oil demand down. And you see the oil price inching downward because of COVID in China, as well as the release of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Should Biden be doing more to promote U.S. domestic production of oil and shale oil and natural gas and liquefied natural gas. It goes against his climate policy instincts, but isn't this a time where we need to balance those?
Well, we've certainly seen that change starting around November when the Biden administration actually started calling for more oil and gas production. Because right now, if it was not for the shale revolution in the United States, were it not for the fact that the U.S. is going to be the world's largest exporter of LNG, Europe would be in a much worse situation. And so I think there's been a grudging recognition that this is a great strategic asset for the United States and a great strategic asset for Europe and increasing production. I think, Walter, if I can add just one thing that would be helpful, is to put away those old slogans like price gouging, which really don't connect to what's happening in a global
In other
oil
words,
market.
Biden is accusing the oil companies of price gouging,
Yeah,
and you say he should stop.
This is a global market where you have basically a shortage situation. And what I think the lessons of history show that when you're in a crisis, when you're in a wartime, and this is a wartime right now, you need close collaboration between government and the companies in order to manage the complex logistics and supply chains that keep 100 million barrels a day of oil flowing around the world. And so, political rhetoric is not what you need. What you need is cooperation.
You run the most influential energy conference in the world, Sarah Week, which happens in Houston each year. And this year you had John Kerry, the envoy for climate. And I think he was pushed quite a bit on shouldn't we balance our desire to fight climate change with a need right now to increase oil and gas production. How did he play that out?
He did see that this is a grave international crisis and that part of the solution to it does involve U.S. oil and gas production, because otherwise, you could see what happened in the election in France, the first round, with Marine Le Pen. If you have turmoil and shortage and prices shooting up, then this coalition to deal with Putin's war in Ukraine can really erode. And so you need to balance your climate objectives, your long-term objectives, with the realities that we're now in a crisis.